Oi, pessoal, boa noite, muito bem-vindos aqui ao nosso encontro dessa noite com o Georg Screenes. A gente já vai começar aqui o nosso bate-papo, né? Enquanto o pessoal vai chegando, a gente vai se apresentando aqui. Para a gente é uma enorme alegria, enquanto joio e trigo, e também tenho certeza que para a CT Promoção da Saúde, poder fazer esse encontro, que para a gente é um dos encerramentos de um mês, o mês do ano em que a gente mais fala sobre alimentação, né? Por incrível que pareça, isso existe, né? A gente fala sobre alimentação todos os dias, mas outubro é particularmente importante para todo mundo que trabalha, que pesquisa sobre alimentação, e esse ano ainda mais importante com o contexto que a gente vive aqui no Brasil, né? Então, bom, essa live, esses encontros fazem parte de um curso que tem sido oferecido pela CT e pelo Joio, especialmente voltado, exclusivamente voltado para profissionais da área de nutrição, e esse curso já está na segunda edição. Então, aqui essa noite, a gente vai ter pessoas que estão no curso e pessoas que também não estão no curso, mas têm tido interesse nessa discussão sobre nutricionismo. E para a gente, esse é um momento já diferente do encontro anterior, em que a gente teve a presença do Georg Screenes, né, quando estava sendo lançado o livro Nutricionismo, porque a gente vê como esse conceito, como essa ideia tem sido rapidamente apropriada pelas pessoas, tem sido rapidamente uma chave de raciocínio muito potente para justamente a superação desse paradigma que aposta no reducionismo nutricional. Então, esse é um bom momento já para chamar aqui o nosso convidado, Georg Screenes, professor da Universidade de Melbourne, na Austrália, e autor do Nutricionismo. Screenes, muito boa noite, seja muito bem-vindo aqui ao nosso bate-papo dessa noite. Espero que a gente possa explorar alguns assuntos que a gente andou discutindo antes e nos últimos meses, né?
Thank you, João. It really is a pleasure to be here. First of all, thank you everyone for organising this event, to ACT and Ojoyo, and everyone involved in putting this together. But especially for the course that many of you have been involved in. It sounds a really exciting course. I wish I could be involved in it myself if I could speak Portuguese. But I'm just really pleased to hear that you're engaging with these ideas and thinking them through. And so it's great to be here. And I'd really like to discuss these issues with you. And because I think there is still so many issues to work through, and so much has changed and is changing just over recent years. So I certainly welcome your questions, and we have some material to present as well. João, how should we begin?
Bom, eu queria começar, Screens, falando justamente assim dessa questão de como esse conceito tem sido apropriado na discussão aqui no Brasil, né? Então, acho que a gente já começa esse nosso encontro vários passos adiante em relação aos encontros anteriores, no sentido de que 4 anos atrás, quando a gente, nas nossas reportagens, ou quando pesquisadores, organizações usavam essa expressão, era sempre preciso explicar o que é essa expressão nutricionismo e o que é o reducionismo em termos de nutrientes. E agora a gente já começa um passo à frente, que a gente está falando justamente sobre a superação desse paradigma, né? Então, o nosso encontro aqui vai abordar vários aspectos relacionados a essa ideia de por onde superar esse paradigma do nutricionismo na nossa vida cotidiana, em políticas públicas, na abordagem nutricional, na abordagem em redes sociais e na comunicação, né? Então, acho que a gente podia falar um pouco sobre esse aspecto, assim, para você, depois de tantos anos, né, que você trouxe esse conceito, que você pensou sobre esse conceito e formulou a partir dele toda uma ideia de abordagem sistêmica da alimentação. De que maneira você vê a evolução do debate sobre esse assunto e de que maneira que você entende que a gente pode superar o paradigma tão reducionista em torno da nutrição?
Yes, okay. So I guess I've been developing these ideas over the past 20 years, and the book first came out and probably nearly 10 years ago now, eight years ago. And already at that time, there's already, as I talk about in the book, there was already a shift going on away from within nutrition research, away from just talking about nutrients to talking about foods and dietary patterns. So this was already starting to happen within the science, but there wasn't, I think, a broader critical reflection on this. So I was very happy to contribute and to sort of, to that discussion, which was just starting to happen. And I think it really has, gone a long way over the past 10 years up until now, for various reasons, and because those discussions were already happening within nutrition research. But what's also happened in that time, and I know we'll be talking about the NOVA classification and the ultra-processed food concept, that has also, and also the Brazilian dietary guidelines, that has contributed so much to this critique of nutritionism, because those very concepts and the guidelines were all based on, in a sense, a rejection of just an exclusive focus on nutrients. And they were very much putting in practice the sorts of ideas I was talking about in the book. So that has been incredible, that the impact of those ideas and the guidelines, and not just in Brazil, I think, but really around the world, they really are having an impact within the scientific community, but also now, I think, much broader public debate as well. But perhaps because this classification system and the guidelines happening in Brazil, maybe that discussion is more advanced to some extent in Brazil. I'd be interested to hear about that. So I think we've come a long way just in those 10 years, and there's been this evolution. At the same time, and hopefully what we'll talk about today, is that there's still much work to be done, to be thought through what an alternative to nutritionism really looks like when we, because it's not just about not talking about nutrients and talking about foods and dietary patterns. That's important to sort of shift the focus to foods and dietary patterns, but it's also how we talk about foods and dietary patterns as well, and how we bring all these different levels, these dietary levels together, and integrate them into a coherent framework. I think there is still much work to be done there. And not just those dietary levels, but also bring in other social and economic and cultural and ecological factors as well into a more unified framework. So that's something I'm very interested in, but I think there's still much work to be done there.
Ótimo, acho que é um ótimo começo. Eu vou compartilhar aqui alguns slides que você trouxe para a gente, Georg, e eu já queria convidar as pessoas a irem trazendo perguntas aqui pelo chat, porque acho que elas vão casar muito bem, né? A gente combinou, Georg, de fazer poucos slides, né? Eles servem para a gente mais como pontos de ida e vinda desse diálogo aqui, como pontos de troca. Antes que seja tarde, deixa eu agradecer as pessoas que estão aqui. Bom, primeiro agradecer 3 pessoas que têm sido fundamentais no curso, né, sobre nutricionismo: a Silvia Farias, a Camila Maranha, a Denise Amorim e o Wallace, que não está aqui hoje, mas as 3 estão aqui ajudando a gente hoje a organizar esse encontro, fazendo acontecer, e ajudaram muito na elaboração da programação aqui desse encontro. Também o Bruno, cuidando de toda a parte técnica, e o Cris Robalinho na tradução, trazendo para a gente essa tradução simultânea que vocês acompanham aqui pelo YouTube. Então, bom, Georg, deixa eu compartilhar a tela sem mais demoras para a gente começar a conversar um pouquinho. Deixa eu colocar aqui no formato de apresentação. Pronto. Bom, então, acho que a gente poderia começar falando sobre as alternativas ao nutricionismo. O pessoal está vendo minha tela aí direitinho? Quem tiver aí por trás, opa, passei aqui. Pronto. Queria te pedir que comentasse um pouquinho, que falasse um pouquinho mais sobre, então, essas várias questões relacionadas às alternativas ao nutricionismo.
Okay. So I assume many of you will already be familiar with some of the basic ideas about what nutritionism is as a form of reductionism, and particularly about the reductive focus on nutrients, which has really dominated, nutrition science and also dietary guidelines, over a long period of time. But also the reductive interpretation of nutrients. So it's not that we talk about nutrients, it's just how we talk about nutrients. So hopefully you're familiar with quite a few of those ideas and how that's translated into nutrition research and dietary guidelines, but especially also how the food industry has used that framework to market their foods, and often ultra-processed foods, being marketed as healthy based on their nutrient profile. And also now we're starting to see, and this is another development that's happened over the past 10 years, is really the emergence of a whole range of new regulations, nutrition regulations and policies targeting ultra-processed foods. And this is all very new, really, the past 10 years. And in my book, I didn't talk about that much because there wasn't at the time all that many around. Now we have those, but even these new policies are almost necessarily still focused on nutrients. So, I mean, that's what the sort of book talked about. So to move on to talk about alternatives, and I started talking about this in the book itself, but in a very preliminary way. And as I mentioned before, it is about shifting towards talking about foods and dietary patterns. And I think we are starting to do that. But we also need to be careful that there are other forms of reductionism also that I discuss in the book, which we need to be careful of. So we can talk about foods, but we could also talk about foods in a reductive way. For example, if we start talking about superfoods or functional foods, where we think a single food might give us great health benefits, and the sort of exaggeration of our knowledge of those foods is an example of that. And I think we are talking a lot more about foods now, but in that very reductive way. And there is a lot more spaces to be talking about dietary patterns, I think. And we really, I think, haven't thought through carefully what a dietary pattern is, what exactly it is, and what it looks like, and how we can actually use that to analyze foods and nutrients and so on. So I think there's certainly work to do there. So that's one aspect of talking about alternatives. And as part of that, and in the book, I talked about an alternative paradigm, which I called the food quality paradigm, where we use other forms of knowledge as well, and not just that sort of scientific knowledge of nutrients and foods and so on, but we rely on other forms of knowledge, such as, well, actually looking at levels of processing of foods, and that's where the NOVA classification comes in, but also traditional and cultural knowledge as a legitimate source of knowledge, of food quality and dietary patterns, and also using our senses and our practical experience of growing and cooking food and eating food as a source of knowledge. So finding ways of actually bringing those together and taking them seriously, rather than continually going towards this very quantified scientific knowledge. As I also mentioned, the NOVA classification as well also takes us a long way towards thinking through what an alternative is. And we'll talk about ultra-processed foods more in a minute and the NOVA classification, but just the way that classification system brings the social elements of eating and of food into the framework and of processing is really a big step forward, I think. for creating a much more integrated understanding of food and the food system, both in terms of helping us choose what good foods are, but also in understanding what foods might be detrimental to health, but also what's driving them, understanding the broader, putting in a broader, social and economic context, and understanding what are the social drivers of some of these dietary pattern trends. So that's perhaps, Gerard, I'll just leave it there as a sort of summary of some of these alternatives, and we can talk about them in more detail.
Eu gostaria de pegar essa questão sistêmica, Screens. Uma coisa que eu só me dei conta hoje, depois de muito tempo, eu vou até parar de compartilhar a tela para a gente conversar um pouquinho sobre esse ponto, que você é da Escola de Agricultura e Alimentação da Universidade de Melbourne. E essas duas coisas juntas, elas são algo raro aqui no Brasil, porque, por incrível que pareça, a gente teve um processo político que buscou separar alimentos e agricultura, tratar como se fossem coisas distantes, né? Então, a gente teve um processo de agronegócio, de agribusiness, muito parecido ao dos Estados Unidos, e que a gente está vivendo o ápice dele agora, justamente nesse ano em que a gente vive também o ápice da fome no Brasil, com pelo menos 10% da população numa situação de fome e mais da metade da população numa situação de insegurança alimentar. E a inflação dos alimentos está acima de 10% nesse ano. A gente tem um cenário bastante complexo. Eu queria que você falasse um pouco sobre essa questão assim de alimentos e agricultura, né? Como que a escola de alimentos e agricultura aqui no Brasil são coisas muito separadas mesmo, se tornaram cursos de agronegócio de um lado, cursos de nutrição de outro, como se fossem áreas que não conversam. E de que maneira esse aspecto tão óbvio precisa ser mais explicitado justamente para que a gente possa fazer essa conexão sistêmica em torno do consumo e da produção de alimentos.
Yes, look, you raise a really important issue. As for my school at the university, yes, it is unusual to have agriculture and food together. I should say that most of my school either does agricultural science or food science. There's not much other disciplines like my social science discipline represented. And in fact, those two sciences don't really speak to each other very much at all. They're quite separate. But yes, it is a reflection of how agriculture, how we produce the food back on the farm, has become quite separated from in some ways, from food preparation and consumption, and the way in which the food system has industrialization both of agricultural production, but also now of food processing as well, and retailing and so on. But if I could just speak to what the connections are and how I think we need to reconnect these and understand that I think there is lots of connections between what's happened to agriculture and what's happening to processed foods. And for example, we could say a lot of what happens on the farm now, what it gets produced, is actually to produce ingredients for ultra-processed foods. It's producing lots of soy and grains, sugar, vegetable oils, as well as meat, to go into fast foods and processed foods, rather than those foods being consumed directly by people. And so we've seen very much a narrowing of the diversity of foods being grown on the farm, globally and within countries. And that's also mirroring the very narrow diets that people on low incomes tend to eat all around the world. If you're on a high income, you can afford to source foods from everywhere and a diversity of foods, but that's not for everyone. So that's one parallel. And in fact, I'd go further and say a lot of what gets produced on the farm and in the whole food system is not really food at all. If we think about what gets produced on the farm, that so much of this grain and soy and so on is actually not consumed by people directly. It's fed to animals, which becomes meat, and then people who can afford the meat buy the meat, or it's becomes ingredients for ultra-processed foods. And we can question whether ultra-processed foods are really foods at all, and they're certainly not very nourishing foods. So they're not foods in that sense that we associate with minimally processed foods. So that whole portion also is not becoming food in the sense. We know a lot of our food is actually being used for biofuels now, particularly corn, for example, and sugar being fed to cars as fuel for the cars. And finally, also because of the way we produce and distribute food globally, a lot of the food is also wasted. So very little of the food that's actually produced on the farm actually is feeding people and nourishing people directly. So that's telling us something about how the food system is working or not working. So what is happening on the farm is directly reflecting what's happening in terms of diets and the various forms of malnutrition you sort of referred to that we can also talk about.
Ótimo. Acho que você mencionou algumas vezes a classificação nova, né? E eu entendo que, bom, a classificação nova foi o primeiro artigo publicado sobre ela de 2009, depois, em 2014, vem o Guia Alimentar para a População Brasileira, e daí por diante a classificação nova ganha uma série de usos e uma série de estudos falando sobre ultraprocessados. E eu vou voltar a compartilhar a tela aqui para a gente conversar um pouquinho, então, sobre essa questão de como você enxerga esse momento da classificação nova, né? E de que maneira a gente deve continuar a ter um olhar holístico e sistêmico para o que acontece em torno do processamento de alimentos.
Yes, okay. So this NOVA classification, it really is a very clever classification, which really asks us to take a holistic view of these foods. So if you saw in my nutritionism book, I also present there a classification system, a different classification system for thinking about levels of processing, because I developed that in a sense before this NOVA classification was developed, precisely because we didn't have any classification systems and all the focus was on nutrients. And the classification system I present in the book is similar but different to NOVA. There are many similarities, and the category I use there, instead of ultra-processed foods, I refer to processed reconstituted foods, which are defined fairly similarly as foods that have been broken down into their component parts and built back up again. So there's similarities there. But the NOVA classification is built on a different concept, really, a different way of actually trying to develop these categories that I want to talk about. And I think it's really clever. And it's why I now use this classification system, because I think it does something different. And first of all, obviously the classification system is built on the degree and types of processing, rather than based on nutrients. So that's a really important step forward, I think. And it's not saying that nutrients aren't important, but that we don't actually need to refer to the nutrients in order to make these classifications and understand how these different types of foods in the classification. However, what the other important difference, which wasn't in my classification system, was the purpose of processing. What is the purpose of processing? This is actually built into the very definitions themselves and the classification system. And asking what the purpose is asking, why are these foods being processed in this way? And it's not just the ultra-processed food category, but there's the processed culinary ingredients category also, which is understood as they're the foods like vegetable oils or sugar or salt, which we use when we cook foods to make nutritious and balanced meals. And this can be done in the home or in a restaurant. So it's speaking directly to how we use foods. And the social purpose there is actually to produce delicious food and meals and balanced meals as well. So, and similarly, the ultra-processed food concept is also defined in terms of, the purpose there is often driven by large corporations wanting to make profits. And that's a really important part of that definition of ultra-processed foods. And I think it's the only way we can really understand what ultra-processed foods are, is if we understand that corporations are producing these foods only to make money. And that's the sole purpose. It's not to make balanced, tasty, good quality foods that are also nutritious. That is not driving them at all. And if we understand that, that helps us explain a lot about the nature of these foods, what's in them, and why they're having the sort of health impacts that they are. But the real important part here is that the purpose, the social purpose, the social factors are a part of this system of classification. And in that sense, these categories have already been socialized. So it's not just a technical classification system, it's also has social factors built into it. And that's what I think makes this a very powerful classification system. And what we see at the moment with some of the debates around ultra-processed foods and some of the confusion around this category, I think many people understand it very clearly, but there are those who want to say and suggest that the category itself of ultra-processed foods is much too broad. There's so many different types of foods with so many different ingredients in them, with so many different processing techniques. What is it that really unifies this whole category and allows us to talk about this as one category of foods? Well, what unifies it is not just what's in the food. It's not just the ingredients. It's also who is producing the food and why they're producing it. And that is the corporations. It's the corporations that make this a unified category. They're producing most of these foods, and they're manufacturing them, distributing them, and aggressively marketing them as one big category of food. And that's the only way we can really explain the health impacts of these foods and why they've become such a dominant part of our diets. It's because there are very large corporations behind them. So I think that is the answer to what unifies this category. And it's not just about, the other thing I think that this framework does, and the category of ultra-processed foods does, is not just helps us shift from nutrients to thinking about foods, but also to thinking about dietary patterns. And I think in many ways, ultra-processed foods is a dietary pattern concept and not a food concept. And it's difficult to think in those terms, but it really is telling us a lot about our dietary patterns and how we're eating and how those dietary patterns are changing. And of course, in many ways, they have become to define our dietary patterns. In some countries, in the US and the USA and the UK, over 50% of the diet now is ultra-processed food. So it's definitely, we can talk about an ultra-processed dietary pattern in those countries. In Australia, where I am, it's 42%. But importantly, within the country like Australia, the average is 42%. But in fact, a large portion of the population, about a fifth, almost 80% of their diet is ultra-processed. So this really is defining our dietary patterns now. So I think this concept really challenges us to think differently about food and food systems, to bring the technical dimensions together with the social dimensions, and to be thinking not just about foods, but be thinking about dietary patterns. And that means also that we need to think about policy and regulations differently, that we can't just be regulating ultra-processed foods as we might regulate other foods, minimally processed foods or processed foods. We have to deal with these foods differently because they're a different type of food. And they're very strongly connected to the corporations that produce them. And we need to sort of regulate both, I think, and regulate the products, but also the corporations as one package, if you like.
Ótimo, Georg. É muito interessante. Só queria reforçar um convite para o pessoal que está assistindo, de que já vá deixando aí as contribuições, comentários, perguntas no chat, que a gente já vai pegando, não precisa esperar. Esses slides estão aqui para nos apoiar mesmo, né, nesse diálogo, para a gente ir voltar neles, e não tem necessidade da gente esperar um momento expositivo para depois abrir para essa conversa. E eu queria justamente trazer um comentário aqui do chat, da Érica Maiana, Georgi. Ela fala, em cima do que você comentava sobre a classificação nova, ela fala que eu penso que essa questão que você está abordando, ela se encaixa muito bem na apropriação das indústrias a respeito do veganismo, de produtos plant-based. E eu queria aproveitar para pegar essa questão para falar um pouco da minha experiência enquanto repórter que cobre a indústria de alimentos, porque a gente vê uma certa tensão, uma certa divisão dentro da indústria de ultraprocessados sobre o que fazer com a classificação nova, né? A nossa sensação é de que existe um sentimento majoritário de que é preciso combatê-la e até conseguir se livrar dela, se possível, conseguir revogar o guia alimentar para a população brasileira, né? Essa passou a ser uma ofensiva declarada nos últimos 2 anos. E, de outro lado, como isolar a questão dos ultraprocessados para ver se isso também se torna um produto, né? Então, acho que tem um caso bem clássico, assim, para a gente entender isso, que é o do ketchup, ketchup Heinz, que eles fizeram uma propaganda falando que é um ketchup com poucos ingredientes e nenhum aditivo artificial, né? É só tomate, açúcar, alguma coisa assim. E o próprio, eu vi uma palestra de um dos desenvolvedores desse produto, em que ele fala que o guia alimentar passou a ser um guia para eles, passou a ser uma diretriz para eles no desenvolvimento de novos produtos. Só que isso criou também um desafio para a Heinz, porque quando ela explicitou que ela tinha um ketchup com pouquíssimos itens, com pouquíssimos ingredientes e nenhum aditivo artificial, as pessoas se perguntaram sobre os outros produtos do portfólio dela, que eram bastante problemáticos. Então, acho que esse caso dialoga bastante bem com o que você estava falando, né, sobre a necessidade de olhar para padrões alimentares e não para produtos isoladamente.
Yes, that's a very interesting development. And where companies, food companies, are trying to appropriate some of these new trends. And it's been happening for a few years now where, over the past, 10 years, consumers are looking for much more minimally processed foods and whole foods and so on. And companies have responded by trying to either bring more whole ingredients, minimally processed ingredients into their products, and to remove some artificial additives. So that's been happening, but yes, it's a very dangerous game for them because they want to do it they can only do it up to a certain point, and they want to be able to market those benefits as well. But it very much relies on the public not asking too many questions of those products and other products as well. But these companies are very clever. They're always trying to, they're always moving forward. They're always, I think, one step ahead of us in their marketing. And yes, you mentioned the plant-based vegetarian food, alternatives is a good example of that, where companies are trying to jump onto one trend, and that's towards plant-based diets. But often, these foods are usually ultra-processed, packaged foods, particularly because they're trying to mimic and copy the taste of meat or dairy products. And that's nothing new in itself, because I think most ultra-processed foods are trying to do that. They're trying to imitate or simulate the taste and the texture and the smell, and the appearance of real foods. So food companies are actually very good at this game, playing this game of simulation. But it's all based on, foods being broken down and then built back up again, and the use of additives and so on. And so this is the problem for these corporations now, is if too many people start to ask questions about ultra-processed foods, and we start to regulate, against ultra-processed foods, these companies could not be, are going to be in a very difficult position. And that's why we have that very, very strong pushback, as you mentioned, Joao, from the food industry against this concept. They're working very hard to keep it out of dietary guidelines and out of regulations. They're putting a lot of pressure, I think, on governments to do that. Even while I think many in the scientific community are embracing this concept, we're seeing a real split here now because governments are being pressured not to. But even that is changing. We're seeing some countries, starting to refer to the concept of ultra-processed foods in their dietary guidelines. So I think all of this is moving so quickly. This is a real game here. And over the past 10 years, there have been so many developments. And even now, year by year, it's a real game. And the corporations are very much, active and dynamic in this game.
Georg, chegou um outro comentário aqui pelo chat que eu acho que vai criar um desafio para o Cris, tradutor. Cris, eu vou passar essa bola para você, porque aqui Ramos e Flores está perguntando, Screens, o que você pensa sobre o termo comida de verdade? Eu não sei se esse debate se tornou comum na Austrália, aqui sim, e existe toda uma discussão, né, sobre, no nosso contexto social, o quanto esse termo pode ser importante, por um lado, para explicitar a necessidade da gente ter políticas públicas e de ter um paradigma que favoreça a que todos possam comer comida de verdade, mas, de outro lado, o quanto também ele pode soar ofensivo para pessoas que justamente não têm acesso àquilo que é considerado alimento de verdade. E, nesse ponto, acho que tem uma diferença desse período de fome que a gente passa agora para o período de fome, para os períodos de fome históricos no Brasil, né? Que é de que a gente está cada vez mais distante do arroz, do feijão, da mandioca, que são os alimentos essenciais dos brasileiros, né? E também do milho, que se tornou um produto de exportação, porque eles foram se tornando mais caros, e esse é um momento em que ultraprocessados, como miojo, salsicha, já são mais baratos, e existiu uma projeção de que em 2026, uma projeção do pessoal da UFMG e da Universidade de São Paulo, de que em 2026, na média, os ultraprocessados se tornariam mais baratos do que os alimentos in natura, minimamente processados, e acredito até que esse processo tenha se acelerado com a inflação desses últimos 2 anos.
Yes, they're all worrying developments in Brazil. In terms of the term real food, that debate really isn't happening yet in my country, but I'm very pleased to hear that's happening in Brazil. I actually think, even though it's a very simple term and in some ways simplistic, talking about real food or natural foods, I actually think it's very powerful, because what it's saying is that there is a category of food we think is real food, and that there's another category of food that is simply not real food. And that's I assume we're just referring to ultra-processed foods there, although there could be other types of foods as well we put in that category, depending on how they're produced, maybe back on the farm with certain chemicals or in factory farms or whatever. I mean, that would be another discussion as well. But I think that is powerful. And that's, once again, that's what I think the ultra-processed food concept has given us. It's given us a very clear way of differentiating these real foods or minimally processed foods from the ultra-processed foods. Because before that, there was no clear differentiation. It was like, some foods had a bit more salt, sugar, and fat, and some had less. There was no clear boundaries. And that really suited the food industry really well. Because you couldn't just focus very clearly on a category. Now we can do that. And that's why I think the ultra-processed food category is powerful, but so is the term real food. And and I actually think there is science behind this category. It's a very common term, but we can actually identify the characteristics of what makes a food real and not real in terms of its nutritiousness and other characteristics. I think one of the characteristics, for example, of ultra-processed foods is that they are so artificial. There is very little that's left in that food that hasn't been touched by a machine, if you like, hasn't been broken down and put back together. I think that's a very legitimate definition of what a real food is or isn't. And I think it's also the fact that it's a popular term and people can actually engage with it and understand it without having to have the scientific knowledge, but still understanding really what it means. I think that's a useful way forward. As to the whole problem of the fact that people can't afford these minimally processed foods becoming more expensive, and there might be stigma attached then also to people who are forced to purchase cheap ultra-processed foods. I mean, that's very difficult. And that's the very sad situation now where we have a system that, and this is where we have to look beyond just the products and look at the whole, why is it, the food system, what sort of subsidies are built into the current food system such that these foods can be produced so cheaply and yet have such great health impacts and environmental impacts, which we also need to talk about, and yet that's not built into the price of these foods. And it is people on low incomes who are being really forced to choose these ultra processed foods. I mean, there's many things to discuss there, including basically people's wages and social benefits and so on. But it is connected to all these other issues in the food system as well.
Como a gente está falando na superação do paradigma do nutricionismo, eu queria trazer uma contribuição que a Kelly deixou aqui no chat. Ela tem sobre o nutricionismo cotidiano, né? Que é algo que você esclarece bastante bem na sua obra, no seu livro, de que são esses conceitos que vão entrando na nossa rotina, né? Da gente se preocupar com calorias, com deficiência de determinado nutriente, com excesso de gordura, de sal, de açúcar, ou com uma deficiência de vitaminas e minerais, e como isso vai se enraizando também nas nossas preocupações cotidianas. E a Kelly comentou algo muito interessante aqui, que ela tem visto movimentos de produção agroecológica usando o nutricionismo na divulgação dos produtos. Então, eles ressaltam os nutrientes desses produtos, em vez de ressaltar os pontos positivos do modo como eles são produzidos.
Yes. So I guess that does show that this paradigm is still dominant in our lives and in the minds of the public. And there's various reasons why it is still dominant, because it is still used so often in marketing. It's still used by nutrition experts, and still so many nutrition studies do just want to focus on nutrients. And so many weight loss diet programs are still these are very popular programs, are still framed in terms of low carbohydrate diets versus low fat diets and high protein diets. This is still so much the dominant framing. So it's hard for us to escape. And it is difficult, even for myself. I mean, once you have these ideas in your head, as you say, it's hard when you're in the act of eating these foods to not think about them. And whether you're eating highly processed foods or whole foods, it's the same thing. When I'm sprinkling some walnuts on my breakfast, I'm thinking of the omega-3 fats that are in the walnuts or the iron or whatever. But this is constantly being reinforced, I think. And that's where I talk about the corporate capture of nutritionism, because even though I think nutrition scientists have started to shift away from talking about nutrients we're still getting such, it's the corporations that, through their marketing, that are keeping nutrients in front of our faces, every single day, every time we go shopping. Yes, that's still a dominant. And what was the other part of the question? Yeah, anyway, I'll leave it at that.
Eu acho que é um bom momento, uma boa maneira de eu voltar aqui com o slide, Georg, no qual você fala... A gente separou esse slide para falar sobre um artigo recente, no qual você fala sobre a discussão de políticas públicas e da própria comunidade de pesquisa em torno da questão da malnutrição, né? Deixa eu passar aqui o slide adiante, só um segundinho. Queria que você comentasse um pouquinho as ideias que você traz nesse artigo recente e de que maneira lidar com essa questão.
Yeah, so this was a paper I published last year on malnutrition, and the way we classify malnutrition, or the experts classify malnutrition, particularly into either 2 or 3 forms, either undernutrition versus overnutrition, or into 3 forms, undernutrition and micronutrient deficiencies, and the third category of overnutrition or obesity. So that's become the standard way of classifying in different forms of malnutrition today. And we used to, experts, we used to mostly focus on undernutrition, but of course in the last 20, 30 years, now we think of overnutrition and obesity as another form of malnutrition, because of the way in which the food supply has changed and different types of health problems starting to emerge. But now also there's recognition of the double burden of malnutrition, that these different types of malnutrition are actually coexisting within the same country and within the same community, but even within the same families and even within the same individuals, which is a strange idea. But this idea that a person might be both obese but also have micronutrient deficiencies, that's an example of that double burden. So it's been it's an interesting sort of discussion that's happening, and analysis, an important analysis of this double burden. And what it does suggest, of course, is that these are not, because we have this double burden, it could be thought of as 2 separate problems occurring in 2 different parts of the world. That we might have used to have thought of it in that way: the poor countries and the rich countries. The rich countries have obesity and the poor countries have undernutrition. But of course, we know it's probably never been that way, but less and less so today, because these problems are coexisting. And so what it suggests is, if they're not separate problems, they're part of the same food system creating these very same problems. The same sort of economic, social drivers and dietary drivers are creating the same problems. In a sense, the same foods are almost creating the same problems. Now, of course, these problems in different countries and different communities are going to be all going to be quite different in terms of what's driving them. But in this article, I talk about this classification and the double burden of malnutrition and the common drivers. But I go a step further and say, well, if they really are common in these ways, and common drivers, common manifestations, are they really separate conditions? Can we really talk about, undernutrition and obesity as being separate problems in the body itself? How could they both coexist in the same body if they're different conditions? And it suggests these are oversimplified ways of actually talking about malnutrition as it appears in the body. And I think to some extent they're reductive ways of talking about malnutrition in the body. And because in fact, we define some of these forms of malnutrition in terms of nutrients. So once again, it's a form of nutritional reductionism, because undernutrition has been usually defined in terms of people who don't get enough energy or calories. And micronutrient deficiencies is defined in terms of people who don't get enough of specific nutrients. And overnutrition or obesity is defined by people who eat too much energy, or else too much salt, sugar, and fat. So very nutrient-specific conditions. And I think that's problematic for a number of reasons. One is because, In fact, that's not the reality. People who have those conditions, they're not nutrient-specific conditions. In fact, there are many dietary components contributing to each of those conditions, and also other broader social drivers as well, and other health conditions also which contribute. So they're very reductive ways of understanding those conditions. But also the danger is, I think, if we define the problem in terms of nutrients, too much or too little of particular nutrients, then we're straight away defining the solutions as in terms of nutrients, that if we just give people more of particular nutrients or less of particular nutrients, we'll solve the problem, which I don't think is the case. But also that gets exploited by both governments and by food companies. It's exploited by governments because governments can say, we don't have to change the food system or our economic system. We can just put micronutrients into foods, for example, and deal with the problem that way. We don't have to give people a more diverse diet. We can just give them more micronutrients. Or if they're eating too many ultra-processed foods, we can just reformulate those foods and take some of the salt, sugar, and fat out, and everything will be okay. So the food companies like those, because it doesn't challenge their model. And in fact, it actually supports their model, their economic model. And it lets governments off the hook as well. So, and I think of this as a sort of, these as reductive ways of thinking about the body. And I talk about this also in the nutritionism book, that it goes hand in hand with reductive approaches to understanding food. And direct connections are made between nutrients in the food and certain conditions in our bodies.
Gary, tem ponto que surgiu aqui no chat e eu vou tentar resumir aqui a questão, porque eu acho que ela ajuda a gente a dialogar com esse ponto e a passar para uma próxima questão que tem a ver com os problemas ambientais e sociais relacionados ao sistema alimentar. A Camila Almeida deixou aqui uma pergunta que ela gostaria de saber a opinião sobre o fato de o grupo das carnes, laticínios e ovos serem listados como não processados. E ela faz a ponderação aqui, né, que esses grupos, eles precisam de processamento térmico para a manutenção da integridade microbiológica e que talvez fosse coerente uma reformulação da classificação nova nesse sentido. Mas a pergunta que me parece interessante de caminhar a você aqui é o seguinte, a pergunta é justamente sobre a questão ambiental, né? Uma vez que a questão do impacto ambiental também é uma pauta, também seria coerente, uma vez que a questão do impacto ambiental também é uma pauta, seria coerente falar numa reformulação da classificação nova, para pensar também nesse impacto ambiental relacionado à produção de alimentos?
Yes. Do you mean related to agricultural production or food processing production?
Vou pedir para a Camila esclarecer aqui para a gente, só para ter certeza de que eu não estou falando besteira. Me parece que ela está fazendo ênfase à questão de que esses alimentos precisam de processamento térmico para a manutenção da integridade microbiológica, e que então seria coerente uma reformulação da classificação nova para diferenciar nesse grupo 1 os alimentos com maior e com menor gasto de energia e de emissão de gases. Então, me parece que ela está fazendo referência ao processamento.
Okay, yeah. I see, okay. Yep. So yeah, let me talk about the environmental impacts. Firstly, I should say, the NOVA classification is great for understanding levels of processing, but we can't necessarily use that framework to explain everything in the food system, including environmental impacts and what's happening back on in agricultural production as well, because it is about what happens at the processing stage. But still, there are important questions to ask. But as to the question, and I was just to speak to the environmental impacts of ultra-processed foods. Yes, I think at the moment, when there's so much concern now about the environmental impacts of the food system, and lots of reports and lots of analysis, and most of it focuses on agricultural production, and particularly the production of meat and dairy as being the biggest impacts. And ultra-processed foods and food processing is only thought of being a very small component of the overall impact, because they seem to just be focusing on, you know, the processing stage, you know, and maybe the packaging as well. But I think that's a misunderstanding of what the real impacts of ultra-processing is, because when, you know, as ultra-processed food production's risen, it's actually reshaping the entire food system. And our whole food system is being designed now to produce ingredients for ultra-processed foods, but also for the meat industry, I should say. They're the two big industries being supplied. And that's why, you know, we're cutting down forests in Brazil to grow soy or to grow cattle, you know, as ingredients, or, you know, and vegetable oils and so on. So these are having huge impacts. And if we just look at the individual products and what's in them, and do some sort of calculation on those products, I think you're not going to really understand the full impact. Because the other thing about ultra-processed foods, often the ingredients in them are globally sourced. They're brought from around the world. Wherever they're cheapest to buy, they're produced on a massive scale, those ingredients, and they have all sorts of environmental impacts. So we really need, once again, a broader framework for understanding how these foods are completely transforming the food system and creating a very unsustainable food system. And just looking at the particular ingredients in a food, in a particular product, or the packaging, doesn't reveal that. Now, as to the you know, the environmental impacts of, and the health impacts of thermal processing, I mean, I can't speak to that directly. But it's, once again, we can focus on particular processing techniques, but more important is to say, what are they a part of? What type of food system they're a part of? And sorry, I just remember the part of the question from before, I think it was, and it's related to this one, about agroecology, the agroecology question, and how people who promote agroecology are using the nutrient framework to promote to say why these foods are healthier, because they've got higher in nutrients. And yes, I agree. That tends to be, I think, a mistake of that movement to try and only reduce the health impacts, whether it's the benefits or the impacts, only in terms of the nutrients, because agroecology can contribute to good health in many ways, and can produce very nutritious foods which aren't necessarily measured just in terms of nutrients. So yeah, I think whether we're talking about health or environmental impacts, we need to talk about some of the specifics, you know, the specific impacts, but also to put them in a broader framework, I think.
É muito interessante, você trouxe esse ponto no começo e agora a gente retomou esse aspecto da discussão sobre ultraprocessados e os problemas dos impactos ambientais das carnes e dos grãos utilizados para a ração animal como parte de uma mesma situação, né? E eu acho que o Brasil é um espaço geográfico muito interessante, que talvez seja único nessa discussão por vários aspectos. Assim, eu vou listar dois, né? Primeiro porque, pelo guia alimentar e por tudo que se explicitou aqui em torno da questão dos ultraprocessados, esse debate sobre os ultraprocessados ganhou, de fato, uma outra atração, né? Ganhou, de fato, uma expressão muito grande no debate público, no sistema de saúde, virou políticas públicas, enfim. Então, existe uma discussão sobre ultraprocessados e que vai tendo essa tentativa de captura corporativa, como a gente estava conversando agora há pouco, né? E na outra ponta, a gente se transformou num espaço único de produção de grãos que são usados para ração animal, na grande maioria, né? Especialmente a soja e o milho, e de produção de carne, né? Então, somando essas três culturas, a gente tem mais de 200 milhões de hectares cultivados, o que é mais do que um México inteiro, para a gente ter uma dimensão do que é isso, né? Para quem está aqui no Brasil, é o estado do Amazonas inteiro, mais Minas Gerais ou mais Mato Grosso, pode escolher a combinação que você quiser, uma coisa muito, muito, muito grande. e que veio se agravando nos últimos anos, à medida que esse processo do agronegócio passou a sustentar a balança comercial brasileira, né? Então, pelo menos um quarto da balança comercial brasileira é a exportação de soja para a China hoje. Então, esse processo, que antes havia uma discussão se o Brasil era tão grande que a agricultura familiar e o agronegócio poderiam conviver pacificamente, a gente já não tem muita dúvida de que essa convivência não é pacífica, né? Ela tem de fato avançado o agronegócio tem de fato avançado sobre a produção de alimentos no Brasil, e as projeções do Ministério da Agricultura para 2030 são bastante negativas nesse aspecto, de que a gente ainda vai perder metade da área de produção de arroz e 40% da área de produção de feijão. Somando arroz, feijão e mandioca, a gente vai ter perdido 8 milhões de hectares desde 1994, o que seria pouco para o agronegócio. Quando a gente fala sobre produção de alimentos, é muita coisa. Então, eu estou fazendo esse longo preâmbulo para dizer de como o Brasil talvez seja, mais uma vez, um espaço que pode ser muito novidadeiro na formulação de ideias e de políticas públicas, porque acho que isso vai se dar pela própria emergência da situação, sabe? Se a gente tem hoje uma inflação de alimentos e uma população passando fome, pelo menos uma parte disso se deve, uma parte muito relevante disso, se deve à maneira como está estruturado esse sistema alimentar, né? E como ele foi reestruturado, de fato, nas últimas 3 décadas.
Yeah, I wasn't aware of that decline in the production of crops like rice. But yes, you're painting a very, tragic situation there in Brazil, but also, it's highlighting what the very real contradictions, massive contradictions in your country in the food system, and also highlighting the link between what's happening on the land and on the farm with what's happening in the home in terms of people's access to food, diversity of foods, and ultra-processed foods, and the direct connections there. So real contradictions, but I think, perhaps as you're suggesting, it's out of those contradictions that some alternatives emerge, alternative ways of thinking and action. And that's why I'm quite inspired by what I see happening in Brazil in that sense. And the level of discussion and some of these ideas, even the fact that the ultra-processed food and the NOVA framework came out of Brazil was not a coincidence, I think. And in fact, in my nutritionism book, I also talk about some contradictions in the ways that we think about nutrients and so on, and how those contradictions can actually generate, new crises, but also new ways of thinking. And I think, Brazil has been a country of contradictions, particularly under your former government, where there was support for the growth of that soy and the livestock sector, but also there were some very good social policies, food security policies, the zero hunger policies at the local level. So that was a real, I think, contradiction, but a good contradiction in some ways, that there was actually that sort of support, but perhaps not so much under the current government. As to going forward, I mean, it presents real challenges. I've got no answers here, but other than if you can start making those connections between what happens on the farm and what happens on people's dinner plates, connections between agriculture and ultra-processed foods, concepts like real foods, then, to get that discussion going and to turn that into policy, that would be exciting.
Georg, tem uma questão que surgiu aqui no chat, que eu acho interessante para a gente falar um pouquinho sobre as lacunas que a gente precisa fechar na pesquisa e na formulação de políticas públicas e no nosso cotidiano, que é sobre a presença de agrotóxicos em ultraprocessados. Recentemente foi publicado um levantamento do Instituto Brasileiro de Defesa do Consumidor, em que eles fizeram testes em alguns produtos, uma gama de produtos relativamente limitada, não me lembro se eram 20 produtos, mas que foi suficiente para a gente ver que havia resquícios de agrotóxicos em ultraprocessados, né? Porque justamente nessa discussão sobre ultraprocessados, algumas pessoas falavam, eu não sei o que eu faço, se eu como o alimento in natura cheio de agrotóxicos, ou se eu como ultraprocessado, cheio de sal, açúcar e gordura, como se não houvesse resquício de agrotóxicos também nos ultraprocessados, né? Ele é tão desfigurado, foi tão transformado que as pessoas até esquecem que lá atrás ele foi uma commodity, né? Ele foi milho, ele foi soja, ele foi trigo. E acho que essa é uma lacuna, né, na pesquisa científica, a gente ainda não tem total compreensão sobre a presença de agrotóxicos em ultraprocessados. E eu queria te pedir que comentasse outras lacunas que você enxerga na discussão sobre a superação do nutricionismo de maneira mais geral.
Well, in terms of pesticides in foods, I think that's probably right. We haven't got that sort of evidence around, in what types of foods it occurs in. We can probably suspect that ultra-processed foods, because they're mostly, the ingredients are industrially produced on a large scale, often imported. They're very likely to be produced with pesticides. Much more likely than if you're buying fruit and vegetables from a local, or even grains from a local market. Of course, they can also be imported and grown on a large scale, but and that's where I guess we need to do those studies. And I'm guessing what they will show is that these foods, minimally processed foods versus ultra processed foods, are coming from different food systems. And I think that's where we need a shift in thinking, not just differentiating between these different types of foods, but that the foods are connected to two different types of food systems. And some people are describing these different food systems in terms of contrasting a sort of corporate industrial food system versus a local peasant food system. Now, these are simplifications, of course, because of course these systems don't exist separately in the real world. There's all sorts of interconnections. But I think it is helpful to some extent to think of these different systems, and that these different systems are driven by very different logics, and very different practices and very different interests. And then in terms of the specific question around pesticides, we can probably, assume that there's different levels of pesticides, forming part of these products as well. But I agree that's probably a research gap which needs to be filled. And really, the evidence around environmental impacts of ultra-processed foods and many of these issues have just not been explored at all.
É interessante que acho que tem um impacto ambiental que é mais claro para as pessoas, que é sobre a produção do plástico, né? Acho que essa questão foi ficando mais explícita e alguns relatórios conseguiram, a nível global, mostrar como a Coca-Cola é a grande responsável pela produção de garrafas plásticas, né? E essas garrafas plásticas, mundo afora, se tornaram um problema que a gente ainda não tem uma solução tecnológica para lidar com ela, a gente ainda não tem uma saída para essa questão. E falando um pouquinho mais assim sobre saídas, porque nosso tempo está voando, na verdade, a gente já está na metade final aqui do nosso encontro. E falando um pouquinho mais sobre saídas, tem uma pergunta aqui do chat que é sobre quais soluções que as empresas apresentam para enfrentar a obesidade e a fome. E eu vou me permitir reinterpretar aqui de te perguntar como que você vê as soluções que as empresas apresentam para lidar com obesidade, fome, e especialmente nesse contexto de pandemia que a gente viveu nesses últimos 2 anos.
Yeah, so food companies are very good at turning, a crisis into an opportunity, and they've certainly been doing that through the pandemic. But really, they've been doing this for a long time now, particularly over the last 20 years, since the emergence of the so-called obesity epidemic in some parts of the world 20 years ago, food companies, even back then, were very quick to understand, to try and position themselves as part of the solution. And that meant trying to frame the problem in a particular way, such that their products could be presented as a solution. And so Coca-Cola is actually a good example of that, where they wanted to frame the problem of obesity as one about calories in, calories out, about energy balance. And then, of course, come out with a range of products which were low in calorie because they were high in artificial sweeteners. So that particular narrative was pushed by Coca-Cola. Other food companies found other ways to present themselves as a solution to obesity, by having certain ingredients in their products, in otherwise ultra-processed products, which were are meant to be good for weight loss. And the best example of that now is protein. Protein is somehow the best macronutrient, and it satisfies you more, maybe helps you eat less food, and so on. And even the plant-based burgers that we see there, they are also sort of marketed as high protein foods. So food companies have been very good at positioning themselves as a solution to obesity, but also now undernutrition as well. And once again, they've been doing this for quite a while. So with micronutrient fortified foods. Now, they're not new. We've had micronutrients added to breakfast cereals for decades and decades. That's not a new thing. What is new, though, is that these used to be targeted at people who didn't necessarily have nutrient deficiencies, but they might be concerned that they might have had nutrient deficiencies, and it just became another marketing point for these products. But now we see companies really aggressively targeting people on very low incomes, people at the bottom of the economic pyramid around the world, who actually might have very deficient diets, and they're repackaging their foods for those. They're marketing them with the micronutrients, so that's the marketing angle, but also putting them into smaller packages that they can sell really cheaply. So really trying to target people on very low incomes in that way as well, and just trying to sell, because it's a very big market for those. There's many people in that market, billions of people who are earning less than $2 a day, and if they can just produce lots of small packages, they can make a lot of money. And I imagine similar things have been happening through the pandemic as well, a targeting of people who become very vulnerable, economically vulnerable, and targeting the marketing, but also the packaging and the packaging size. So that's been happening around the world, and I'm guessing that's happening in Brazil as well. And once again, it partly comes down to how we define healthy foods and unhealthy foods, and it's the ability of these companies to focus on the nutrients in their products, which really gives them an advantage, rather than focusing on the actual ingredients in their products.
Bom, Georg, nós estamos caminhando aqui para o final do nosso encontro. A gente teve aqui, está tendo ainda, uma participação ótima, assim, chegou a ter 90, quase 100 pessoas online, mais de 200 e tantas pessoas passaram aqui ao longo desse nosso encontro. E eu queria, primeiro te deixar uma pergunta, te fazer uma pergunta sobre um símbolo, um ícone que ainda é bastante presente aqui na discussão sobre nutrição no Brasil, e a gente conversava sobre ele de manhã, né, sobre a pirâmide dos alimentos, que até você aborda no seu livro, e aqui no Brasil a gente conversava como ele ainda é bastante presente nas faculdades de nutrição, e bastante presente também nos cursos de ensino fundamental e médio para crianças e adolescentes. E esse ícone, ele reflete uma era, um determinado paradigma, né, ou é um dos reflexos desse paradigma. como que você enxerga essa questão da pirâmide dos alimentos e você queria te perguntar como que você enxerga a possibilidade de criar novos ícones que reflitam uma abordagem mais sistêmica da alimentação. Você vê essa possibilidade? Eu penso que é bastante desafiador, porque justamente o sistêmico, muitas vezes, ele não cabe numa figura, né, numa imagem. É muito mais difícil de resumir aquilo que tem múltiplos laços, múltiplas conexões. Como que você enxerga esse desafio?
Yeah, so that's an interesting question. So, I mean, the food pyramid itself, it's interesting that you still have that there now that you have your new dietary guidelines, which really provide a different way of thinking about food, and which encourages to think in terms of meals and dietary patterns and even ecological context. But the food pyramid just keeps dragging us back to this old view of food as single foods fitting into those particular categories. And we know that old pyramid was very much still based on nutrients, carbohydrates and proteins and fats. That's really what that's trying to. So it's interesting that you're still relying that. And the other thing that pyramid never helped us do is to understand what food processing was doing to our foods as well, or what processed foods looked like. So that's worrying. As to what an alternative, so it's interesting that you never thought about an alternative, even for your dietary guidelines, whether there's one image that sort of captures it all other than the classification system, or better still, an image which brings together the various elements, the social and the ecological, but also the political and the power relations. So of course, obviously the food guide is for the public, but in the food literature, the sort of scientific food literature, the food systems literature, there are many attempts to create food system maps, like, a big map of the food system showing all the different sectors of the food system and all the different actors, and which, become very complex. They show these very complex associations between everything. And I'm not very satisfied with those maps, because I think they get very complicated, but also they miss some very simple, important relationships in the food system. So, for example, I think, the most powerful players in the food system now are the corporations, but you never see them in those maps. So I think there is a need for much simpler representations about both how the food system is currently operating, but also how we can think about it differently, and how we can think about constructing not just a healthy meal, but also a healthy food system. So interesting question. I haven't thought about how to represent that, Joel, but it would be a great project to undertake.
Ótimo. A gente vê como essa chave simples de raciocínio que a pirâmide oferece e que outros símbolos oferecem, muitas vezes é importante para as pessoas começarem uma discussão, né? Bom, Georg, eu queria mais uma vez agradecer muito a atenção que você tem tido conosco, não só nessa noite, para você aí já de manhã, como ao longo de toda essa trajetória. Queria lembrar para o pessoal que essa live faz parte de um curso, né, sobre como superar o nutricionismo, e que no ano que vem a ACT e o Joio já estão preparando novidades aí em torno desse curso. E queria dizer também para você, Georg, que do meu ponto de vista pessoal, estava me lembrando aqui que 2 anos atrás a gente trocava e-mails sobre a sua vinda para o Brasil em 2020, lá por maio, junho, e a gente não podia imaginar o que estava a caminho. Nesse momento, no Brasil, a gente tem uma situação diferente, eu acho, porque diferente em relação à conversa anterior que a gente teve, que você teve com a Rita Lobo, né? A gente tem já a maior parte da população vacinada e alguma perspectiva de um 2022 melhor, em que, quem sabe, finalmente podemos realizar esse seu encontro. Seria um grande prazer recebê-lo aqui, e pelos comentários que eu estou vendo no chat, você seria recebido por uma massa no aeroporto, uma loucura. Tá realmente É muito interessante ver como que as pessoas se apropriaram desse assunto e têm discutido ele, inclusive em espaços que normalmente são de promoção do nutricionismo funcional, né, de promoção de visões reducionistas, como, por exemplo, redes sociais como Instagram. A gente vê que mesmo nesses espaços tem gente agora propondo uma discussão sistêmica e propondo superar esse paradigma reducionista.
Well, thank you. On the question of, look, I would love to come back to Brazil, and as soon as I can, I'll certainly be there. I was looking forward to visiting to launch the book, but that didn't happen. But yes, I'd very much like to come over and have these discussions face to face. And I think this is a real dynamic discussion that has to happen. I don't think anyone's got the answers to any of this, and so I really appreciate this forum. I very rarely get this opportunity to actually engage with people, within these ideas. So I thank everyone who's come along and for your questions. And more importantly, I'm just so pleased that you're, engaging and hopefully helping to develop these ideas. And as I said, I think Brazil's in a really unique position to be able to do that, which is why, I have a lot of time and I want to spend more time in Brazil. So thank you, everyone, for coming along, and thanks to everyone who's organised this event, but also the course as well, which I think it's been so important, and I hope that keeps going. And I want to stay involved and engaged in the course and in these discussions as well. So thank you, everyone.
Ótimo, eu que agradeço. Bom, obrigado a todos que estiveram aqui essa noite. Foi realmente um prazer. Tenho certeza de que a gente sai daqui cheio de ideias e de energia para seguir em frente. Obrigado, gente. Tchau, tchau.